Woke virtue-signaling professors across the country are rushing to microphones to declare their white privilege and admit their inherent racism. Now, thank goodness, the Department of Education is taking them at their word and investigating them for race crimes. Karma is a harsh mistress, ladies and gentlemen, isn't she? You phony preening professors. I'm Dr. Duke, and this is the Dr. Duke Show. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Dr. Duke Show. Flying solo again, which means you get the pretty, not the profound, and the only program that keeps you educated on craziness impacting K-12 classrooms and college campuses around the world. Katie, again, is off today, and we start at Northwestern University's law school, where numerous professors and the interim dean have publicly acknowledged how racist they are and how much they are gatekeepers of white supremacy. So, all right, you remember about 2 years ago, a year ago, when putting your pronouns down, right? I'm Dr. Duke, and my pronouns are he, him, and her, he, him, and they, right? You were virtue signaling through pronouns. Liberals love this kind of stuff. If liberals were in the army, if liberals created their own army, not called Antifa, they'd have all sorts of ribbons and all sorts of decorations and medals and epaulets and cords. They just like to show off just how cool they are, how virtue signaling they are. So now, about last year's news was all these pronouns, right? Where, still at my university, there's not a single email I get from anybody at the university that doesn't end with pronouns, right? We list our pronouns like we would list. It's like carrying your political affiliation right on your chest where people can see it. Well, finally, Betsy DeVos of the Department of Education said, okay, if you're really that racist, then we're going to have to investigate you. This is the great Schadenfreude moment. So recently, Northwestern University's Pritzker School of Law conducted a town hall meeting online during which white professors who attended, began by introducing themselves and acknowledging their racism and their promises to do better. Quote, I am a racist and a gatekeeper of white supremacy, one professor announced. I will work to be better. Look at this here. Emily Mullen, Professor Emily Mullen, to everyone else. My name is Emily Mullen. I am a racist, and worse, I am a gatekeeper of white supremacy. I am somebody who protects white supremacists and enables them. I will work to be better. Not good enough, Emily. And how about this from Sarah Somervoy to everyone? Thank you all so much. My name is Sarah Somervold, and I'm a racist. I will try to do better. How about I'm Jim Spata, and I'm a racist. So this is it now, right? This is what used to be the old 12-step program. How do you become a liberal progressive in 12 steps? Well, you start with the 12-step program, right? First thing is, hi, I'm Jim Spada, and I'm an alcoholic. Now what you got to do is you got to start with, I'm such and such liberal professor, and I'm a racist. Okay, but here's the thing. It's illegal against a number of different pieces of law and legislation to be an overt racism, doing racist things on college campuses. That's not a legal thing you can do. You can't really be a cultural racist on campus. As the one professor said, I am a gatekeeper of racism on campus. I promote it, I protect it. If all of this is true, which of course these preening liberals don't believe it's true. If you really think any of them actually believe they're a racist, you're crazy. They're just using this to get some street cred. They're just doing this to show how with it and woke they are, right? In fact, it's almost like in progressive circles, the more of a racist you call yourself, the more then you free yourself up to do racist things. So what happened? While the admissions were clearly the benefit While these admissions were clearly for the benefit of the woke scolds, such as an admission of racism, if true, would be a violation of Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which states that, quote, no person in the United States shall, on the ground of race or color or national origin, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subject to discrimination under any program actively receiving federal financial assistance. And I guarantee you that the law school at Northwestern near Chicago is benefiting from public funds. So to admit that you're all professors and that you're all racist means you are in a major breach of the law. Now, 4 members of the United States Civil Rights Commission now heard this, and they sent a letter, and there's the letter, to Education Secretary Betsy DeVos asking her to investigate the law school. Oh, the Schadenfreude is just bask in it, right? So these liberals for a long time have gotten away with this. They've gotten away with admitting all these ridiculous things to please the left wing, and then there was never any consequences. Go back to what I've said a number of times. We keep hearing that universities are places where women are constantly assaulted. These huge, made-up, inflated numbers, right? That one in 4 college girls will be raped on campus before she graduates. 50% of women on campus will be sexually assaulted before they graduate. Just absurd numbers. Nobody believes them. Feminists like Christina Hoff Sommers, former feminists like Christina Hoff Sommers, have debunked these claims. So why are they doing it? Why are these big progressive universities claiming there's so much danger to women on college campuses? So they can implement more programs, right? More feminist scholarship will hire, more diverse police forces. We'll get more grants from the federal government to make sure that women are safe. So for a long time, the university administrators had their cake and ate it too. They were able to claim, we're so bad, we're so bad, we're so bad, we're all sexist, we're all racist. And not only did they get punished for that in any way, they were rewarded with grant money, they were rewarded with outside research money to fix these problems. And now finally, they're going to get what they deserve. You can go ahead and claim racist all you want, but why would we send more money to a racist school like Northwestern? And shouldn't we look into perhaps firing those professors who are gatekeepers of racism on campus? So 4 members of the United States Civil Rights Commission sent a letter to Betsy DeVos asking her to investigate the law school, according to a copy of the letter obtained by PJ Media. Quote, "We write to express our concern regarding the admitted racism of several employees at the Northwestern University Pritzker Law School." 4 of the 8 commission members wrote in the letter. The 4 who wrote the letter made clear they were writing on their own and not on behalf of the commission as a whole. But during a recent online town hall meeting, several employees publicly admitted that they are racists, and one even admitted to acting as a gatekeeper of white supremacy. The commission members added, included in this number of admitted racists was James B. Spata, the law school's interim dean, Elizabeth Froling Horner, professor of law. Based on these facts, we ask that you consider conducting an investigation into the Pritzker School of Law's potentially discriminatory practices, similar to your investigation into Princeton University's potential discriminatory practice. And we did a story a couple weeks ago about how Princeton, the chancellor, the president of Princeton University, came out and admitted publicly how racist the organization was, how racist the school still is, how racially unjust the school's practices and attitudes are right now. He's the president of that school. He admitted his own racism. So just like at Northwestern, Pritzker College of Law, Princeton's being investigated as well. When the Princeton story broke, we also reminded you, me and Katie and I did, we reminded you that dozens and dozens and dozens of university professors around the country wrote to Betsy DeVos begging her not to investigate Princeton. The Princeton president calls his whole school racist. And professors say, no, don't do that. You can't investigate that. Literally, liberal professors telling the Department of Education not to investigate cases of racism from white people on college campuses. Why? Because these professors realize it's all just virtue signaling. You can't take it seriously. The call for DeVos to investigate does not come out of nowhere, PJ Media reported. Last month, Betsy DeVos called the bluff of Princeton president Christopher Eisgruber. Eisgruber, which sounds like a really great fascist name, had participated in the same woke rite of confession, publishing a letter confessing to the ongoing racism at his university under his leadership. It seems the president aimed to use these confessions as a rhetorical weapon to push Marxist critical race theory on campus. Bingo. So again, you now know 2 things. 1, that these liberals are full of beep when they tell you these things. They don't think they're racist at all. They think everybody else is racist. Number two, they're being racist for no other, they claim racism and sexism for no other reason than to pose as hip people who condemn themselves. You keep going, Betsy. I really hope this investigation calls for the firing. If you're a racist and you know it, if you're gatekeeping racism, like the president of Princeton said he was, like the professor at Northwestern said they were, then you got to get rid of them. You can't have racists on staff. Get rid of them now. Always happens on the Dr. Duke Show. The first story we do helps illuminate the second story, and our second story is interesting. At Colorado State University, a huge investigation was launched to determine whether or not the athletic programs were racist. Guess what the finding was? No, they're not racist. And guess what happened? They required race training anyway for everybody in the athletic department. Go back to the story we just looked at, right? How college presidents, law school professors start now by introducing themselves as racists and bigots. I'm Professor so-and-so at the law school, and I'm a racist. I'll try to do better. President of Princeton University writes a letter talking about how racist he and his institution are, but nothing's ever happened to them before. This is why. This is why what happens, right? So you go to the trouble of investigating the athletic department. You find that it is not a racist organization, and nevertheless, you're able to force them into your racial training programs anyway. That's why all these liberals are so quick to admit their bigotry. Not because they're going to stop it, but they're going to do all sorts of progressive things to the people under their power to make them even more left-wing. So in other words, even when you're a racist, you are a racist, says Colorado State University. They investigated its athletic department to look for instances of racial insensitivity. Results were that the athletic program was not racist, but more diversity training is planned nonetheless. The university commissioned the law firm Husch Blackwell to look into the issues related to COVID-19 policy compliance and racial bias within the athletics department. Colorado State President Joyce McConnell found the results to be, quote, positive and reassuring overall, unquote. Here was the press release. The investigators found that most student athletes who participated in the investigation disputed allegations of pervasive racial inequities or harassment within their athletic team or the athletic department more broadly. Few individuals alleged that such incidents were widespread or tolerated by coaching staff, unquote. But in the 18-page report that followed, Husch Blackwell law firm concludes, quote, witnesses generally did not assert that such conduct was widespread or tolerated. Importantly, the specific allegations reported in the local media against head football coach Adazio were not substantiated during the investigation. However, Husch Blackwell's final recommendation states that Colorado State should, quote, continue to supplement diversity and inclusion training university-wide with a special focus on the athletics department to advance empathy-building racial sensitivity and cultural understanding. And whenever you hear the word empathy-building, that's a fancy way of saying thought police. We don't care what you think. We don't care if you've done nothing wrong. We don't care if you've behaved in a manner that is responsible and necessary. If you do not have, quote unquote, enough empathy for your cause, which means put away your thinking, put away critical thinking, put away right, wrong, and law, and feel what we tell you to feel. If you don't feel all the time as if you are a racist, and if you don't feel all the time that as a racist, you should be helping unracialify your school or your athletic department, then you're a bigot. Empathy. We found no evidence of wrongdoing, but we urge Colorado State University to go on teaching empathy-based diversity solutions. In other words, stop thinking, stop doing what's logical, stop obeying the law, and start feeling what we feel, or else. And what is the consequence of this shift that our program today has shown you? We went from this idea of admitting racism to be hip and cool, to talk, see how much I care as a white man. I acknowledge that I'm a racist. I acknowledge that everything I have is the result of my own privilege. including the school I run, and therefore nothing happens to me. Well, now it's starting to happen. And this idea that we saw in the second story at Colorado State University, where even though an investigation proved no actual racism, we still have to train people to be more empathetic about racism. In other words, to feel it even if you can't see it or prove it. And now we find out in our fourth story, UC Riverside has now, in California, has now created an anti-racism guide for elementary schoolers. I've warned you about this too. Simply recognizing racism is not enough. Simply not engaging in racism, as we saw at Colorado State, is not enough. We actually have to teach anti-racism. This is a big deal. Rather than simply pointing out what may or may not be cultural instances of racism or lack of inclusion, now we have to have a program that consistently and thoroughly teaches what the progressive left calls anti-racism. The UC Riverside's education department, and a lot of this garbage comes from education departments, is continuing to ruin future generations. The education department created a guide to help elementary school teachers teach anti-racism. The guide is called Addressing Race and Racism in the Early School Years. Researchers with a UC Riverside group called Smooth Sailing started the university-sponsored project after inspiration, yes, from Black Lives Matter protests. According to a fourth-year psychology doctoral student, Ainsley Losh, who led this project, Smooth Sailing wanted to create resources for, quote, those really early school years, unquote, so that teachers could have conversations about race, racism, and differences. Losh wants race to be brought up in the classroom and not have a colorblind mentality. Racism, defined as, quote, prejudice that is held by a person with social and institutional power and privilege. Secondarily, racism operates to maintain a system of advantage based on skin color. Can the students and future teachers get out of this training and programming? The answer is no. They're creating an anti-racist curriculum for little kids. And if you know what I mean, you're talking about, 5, 6, 7, 8-year-olds. These kids are going to be taught now the kids that young who don't think in these kind of abstractions, who are unable to, in the same way it's difficult to tell a 5-year-old that he may or may not be the gender he's born in. There's no a development in the mind that lets a young child come to grips with that. Any more that you can tell a young child that he or she is racist based on the color of her skin, or innocent or victim based on the color of their skin. The purpose of doing this for elementary schools is nothing more than indoctrination. Here's a quote from the actual guide. No child is too young to discuss race. Really? No child is too young. The 6-month-old infant is not too young. The 2-week-old who's barely sleeping at night is not too young. The 4-year-old, the 5-year-old, the 7-year-old. No child is too young to discuss race. Young children, even infants. That's part of the quote, by the way. Even infants, in quotations with an exclamation point. Even infants notice differences among people, such as hair color, eye color, and skin color. Race and racism are difficult topics for elementary teachers to discuss with their students as well as with their parents because, quote, a lack of understanding of social construct of race and systemic racism. Finally, the document defines microaggressions as an implicit bias, describing students with learning disabilities as neurodiverse students, right? Neurodiverse students. And so what you're doing is at the earliest formative years now, you're laying a groundwork that these kids couldn't possibly understand. You're forcing them to see the world in ways you see the world, not the way they do. You're projecting on these kids a high level of discriminate. You're discriminating to fight discrimination. You're forcing kids to become racialized. You're forcing kids to see, not just see, but to see only color and race and difference. So what? So you're going to fight kids? You're going to teach kids to see things the way racists do. only by terms of color. And then you're going to beat on them for the next 12 years of public school because you turned them into racists in the first place. Well, that's how a lot of racial coordinators get hired. What better way to become a diversity officer? Force every little kid to become a racist, then spend the next 20 years beating on them in public schools and universities. It's a slick gig if you can get it, but it's also child abuse. It's time for some real education now. The Persistence of Memory is a 1931 painting by Salvador Dali, and one of the most recognizable works of art in the world and in the Surrealist movement. Since 1934, the painting has been in the collection of the Museum of Modern Art in New York City, which received it from an anonymous donor. It is widely recognized and frequently referenced in popular culture, and sometimes referred to by more descriptive titles, such as Melting Clocks, or The Soft Watches, or The Melting Watches. Go to the picture, Mike. This piece is, again, a masterwork of surrealism. It's a movement that goes beyond Impressionism, goes beyond Cubism, to create surreal or seemingly lifelike but non-lifelike, or images and tableaus that challenge reality in meaningful ways that almost evoke dreamscapes. The piece here introduced the image of the soft melting pocket watch, epitomizing Dali's theory of softness and hardness, which was central to his thinking at the time, in the early 1930s. As Dawn Aids wrote, the soft watches are an unconscious symbol of the relativity of space and time, a surrealist meditation on the collapse of the notions of a fixed cosmic order. And of course, you would be right to recognize in the early 1930s that this is a direct response to what was going on with Einstein and the theory of relativity. As Einstein studied more of the Hubble data, as Einstein was able to view more of the universe through these powerful telescopes, the more he was frustrated because, as a logical thinker, if the world was random, if the universe as we understand it was random and chaotic, then the values, the numerical values of that universe ought to be random too. But the more Einstein studied the numbers, the more he saw that they were coherent. Not just coherent, but so specific that in some instances, if you altered the numbers of the universe just a tiny, tiny bit, everything would collapse, which indeed suggested structure and maybe even intention. Well, these melting clocks here, the withering of time, the idea that time itself as a construct isn't real is one of the great surrealist revelations that came in the wake of Einstein's discoveries. It is possible to recognize a human figure if you look hard enough in the composition, in the strange monster with much texture near its face and much contrast and tone in the picture that Dali used in several contemporary pieces to represent himself. The abstract form becoming something of the self-portrait reappeared frequently in Dali's art. He painted himself into his surrealist context. Going back to the Einstein idea of relativity, the interpretation suggests that Dali was incorporating an understanding of the world introduced by Einstein's theory of relativity. Dali replied that the soft watches were not necessarily inspired by the theory of relativity, but by the surrealist perception of a camembert melting in the sun. We go down to take a last look at the portrait here, the picture here. The orange clock at the bottom left of the painting is covered in ants. Dali often used ants in his paintings as a symbol of decay, time, and the melting of time. Ants signify decay. Another insect that is present in the painting is a fly, which sits on the watch that is next to the orange watch. The fly appears to be casting a human shadow as the sun hits it. In The Persistence of Memory, it employs the exactitude of realist painting techniques to depict imagery more likely to be found in dreams and waking consciousness. And so time and the melting of time, the melting of place, what we know as material and scientifically true gets elided in surreal art, and Dali was a master. And just as a reminder, these premier beverage vessels of freedom are now available when you join our Patriot Club with a one-time $99 tax-deductible donation. Visit patriotclub.us. That's patriotclub.us. Now let's wrap this up with the fun fact of the day. The clock that is used for internet time is determined by an institute in Colorado, which created a clock so accurate it won't lose or gain a second in 20 million years. And that's going to do it for this show. For Freedom Project, I'm Dr. Duke. Until next time, stay educated, my friends.